Cut. The charcoal was still on her fingers when the steward found her, kneeling beside the east granary wall, her shoulders hunched, her body curved around the marks she had been making, like she was trying to protect them from the world. She was not trying to protect them. She simply had not heard him coming. She never heard anyone coming. That was the other thing about her, beyond the silence, beyond the stillness. She existed in a state of perpetual surprise at being noticed, as if each time she was found, some part of her had genuinely expected to remain invisible forever. The marks on the wall were not words, not exactly. They were symbols, angular and precise, a notation system she had developed herself over years of needing to communicate things that no one wanted to hear. The steward, a compact man named Halwyn with the permanent squint of someone who had spent too long staring at ledger columns, looked at the marks the way a man looks at something he doesn't understand and has already decided to be angry about. Again, he said. Her name was Liss, or that was what they called her. She had been at Ashenvale Hold for as long as she could remember, which was not very long, because the head cook had told her once, not unkindly, that she had arrived as a girl of perhaps 4 or 5, with nothing but a fever and a bruise shaped like a handprint on her left arm, and that the pack's former healer had written her into the records as an unclaimed omega of unknown origin, and then moved on to more important things. She had no wolf, she had no voice. She had never shifted, never felt the interior presence that other pack members described as casually as breathing, the animal self, the second awareness, the thing that lived behind the eyes and pressed forward in moments of fear or anger. She had none of that. She was hollowed out in the specific way that Ashenvale had decided years ago was the natural condition of someone like her. But she could see things. That was the problem, and the only thing about her that had ever made anyone in this hold look at her twice, and not kindly. Not visions, not prophecy in the classical sense, not the golden-eyed trance states the old stories talked about. What she had was more like a very precise understanding of pattern. She noticed things that other people's minds smoothed over, the way condensation formed unevenly on the storage room wall, indicating a crack in the foundation below, the specific angle at which the southern watchtower had begun to list, almost imperceptible, 2 degrees since last spring. The discoloration in the bark of the birch trees along the northern perimeter that meant root blight had already spread underground 50 feet further than anyone had mapped. She had been marking these things on walls for 3 years. Not in blood, she was not dramatic by nature, but in charcoal, using a stick she kept tucked behind the water barrel in the lower kitchen. The marks came out in her private notation, symbols for direction, for urgency, for the nature of the danger. She had a symbol that meant fire risk, one that meant structural failure, one that meant contamination, one she used only twice in 3 years that meant people are going to die if someone does not act today. Both times she had used that last symbol, she had been right. Halwyn made her scrub the wall. He always made her scrub the wall. And then, as always, 3 days or a week or a month later, whatever she had marked would come true, and no one would say anything to her about it, because acknowledging that she had been right would require acknowledging that she had a purpose, and the hold had already decided what she was. She was the mute girl in the lower kitchen, who swept floors and shelled peas and occasionally defaced the walls with incomprehensible marks that the steward made her clean up. Nothing more. She scrubbed the marks out with a wet rag and a piece of rough limestone and watched the charcoal smear into grey before disappearing entirely. Her hands were steady. She had learned to keep her hands steady through most things. The steadiness was not calm. It was a performance of calm that had, over many years, become indistinguishable from the real thing, except that she knew the difference. In the specific place between her shoulder blades where the tension lived permanently, a tightness she had stopped trying to release because the effort cost more than the relief was worth. She found out about the war commander's arrival the same way she found out about most things, by being in the room while people talked around her as though she were part of the furniture. The cook, a woman named Bethna, told the second-in kitchen while Liz was deboning pike at the far end of the prep table. Bethna was not a cruel woman. She was not kind either. She occupied the large middle territory of people who had accepted a hierarchy without examining it, and found their comfort in the smooth operation of the parts they controlled. She left the good cuts of bread where Liz could reach them when no one was watching. She had never once asked Liz a question that required more than a nod or a headshake to answer. "The war commander comes for the tribute review," Bethna said, not lowering her voice at all. 3 days, every border hold hosts him before winter. Pack Rise is expected to present full numbers. She paused, stirring something. "Halwyn has been falsifying those numbers for 2 seasons. You didn't hear that from me." Liz kept deboning pike. Her hands were very steady. She thought about this for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she swept the corridor outside the lower hall, where 2 of the senior warriors were arguing in low voices about the tribute rolls and the 43 fighters whose names appeared in the annual count, but who had not been seen in the hold in 8 months. She thought about it while she carried the dinner slops out to the yard, passing close enough to the steward's office door to hear Halwyn speaking to Pack Alpha Mavan in the strained tone of a man explaining something he hoped would not require explaining. She thought about it while she lay on her pallet in the corner of the storage room, wedged between crates of salted provisions that made her hair smell perpetually of preservation brine. The marks she had been making for 3 years had always been about the hold itself. Its structures, its systems, its physical dangers. She had never marked anything political. Political things were not her business. She had no wolf, no voice, no name worth keeping. The politics of Pack Rise were as far above her as the ceiling of the great hall, which she was permitted to clean but not to enter. But 43 names. She sat up in the dark and pressed her palms flat against the cold stone floor. 43 people, registered as present and accounted for in tribute rolls sent to the Crown, who were in reality somewhere else. She had heard enough, standing invisible in corridors, to know the somewhere else was a mining operation to the northeast. She had heard the word contracts. She had heard Halwyn say once, to a visitor whose face she hadn't seen, that the arrangement benefited everyone, which was the specific phrasing of a man for whom the arrangement benefited himself. She pulled the charcoal stick from inside her sleeve, where she kept it now instead of behind the barrel, because Halwyn had found it there twice. She found the wall outside the locked records room. Pale stone, washed regularly, which meant the marks would show clearly, and she began. She worked quickly, as she always did. The symbols came out in her careful notation, each one deliberate. She wrote, "Tribute records, falsified 2 seasons, 43 count discrepancy." She wrote the symbol for contracts and the direction indicator for northeast. She wrote the symbol for locked room and the symbol she used for things that were not her business to know, but that she had learned by existing invisibly in spaces where such things were discussed. She should have stopped. She knew, standing back and looking at what she had marked, that she should have stopped. 3 years of practice told her that walls got scrubbed, and she got punished and nothing changed. But her hand was still holding the charcoal, and there was more wall, and she had spent 3 years marking things that mattered and watching them be erased before they could matter to anyone with the power to act on them. She moved to the next section of wall. She wrote about the southern watchtower. She wrote about the root blight in the north perimeter birches, which had by now compromised the root system of the trees that supported the embankment above the outer road. She wrote about the storage room on the 3rd level, where condensation had been forming unevenly for 4 months, and where, if someone pressed their palm to the inner wall on the east side, they would find it cold in a way that meant the stone beneath had cracked, and the freeze-thaw cycle of the coming winter would bring that section of wall down before spring. And then, because she could not stop herself, because 3 years of silence was a weight she had been carrying so long, she had stopped noticing how much it cost to carry. She added one more thing. Not a warning, not a notation, something smaller, tucked into the lower corner where the wall met the floor, in marks so fine that you would have to crouch to read them. She wrote, "I have been here." She heard the horns from the outer gate. 2 long, 1 short, the signal for a significant arrival. The war commander of the crown, the man who held the king's authority over every border territory in the realm, had arrived at Ashenvale Hold. Liz pressed her fingers flat against the cold wall for a moment, feeling the texture of it, the familiar roughness of stone that had absorbed 3 years of things she needed to say. Then she went back to the kitchen. She was in the storage room, taking inventory of the winter grain, a task assigned to no one, which meant it fell to her, when she became aware of the quality of the noise outside the narrow storage window. The hold had assembled in the outer yard. She could hear the formality of it, the particular silence of a crowd being official, the way it pressed flat under the weight of ceremony. She did not look. There was no reason to look. The war commander's arrival had nothing to do with her. Then the silence changed. She heard it before she understood it. A shift in the collective attention of the yard, a reorientation of energy that she felt more than heard, the way she felt structural things before she could name them. Something had broken from the expected pattern of the arrival ceremony. She looked through the storage window. He had stopped, not at the Pack Alpha's greeting, not at the end of the formal approach where the ceremony dictated he should stop. He had stopped in the middle of the yard, 1 foot still mid-stride, and his head had turned. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, because it was impossible not to register. The kind of tall that made the people around him look slightly wrong in scale. He wore dark grey travelling clothes, not armour, which surprised her, and his hair was close-cropped, lighter than she had expected, the specific shade of brown that went silver at the temples before the rest. There was a scar along his jaw, precise and old, the kind left by a blade rather than a claw. He was looking at the storage room, at the wall, at the window. His eyes, even at that distance, were the grey of winter water just before it freezes, pale and still, and very, very attentive. She pulled back from the window before she understood that she was moving. She heard his voice from the yard, and even through stone and distance it carried with a clarity that was not volume but precision, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard in large spaces. "A moment," he said, then footsteps, not the rapid thunder of ceremony breaking down, but measured, deliberate steps that came directly toward the kitchen entrance. Liz pressed herself behind the grain stack, though she knew it was useless, because whatever had made him stop and turn was still happening. She could feel it, a pulling sensation behind her sternum that had no name in her experience, that felt like nothing so much as a door she hadn't known existed beginning to open. The storage room door opened, not quickly. The latch was lifted with care, the way you open a door when you are trying not to frighten what is on the other side of it. He stood in the doorway and looked directly at her behind the grain stack with the expression of a man who had been searching for something specific and had just found it in an unexpected place. She stared back at him. His eyes did something then. She watched it happen, could not look away from it. They went from that winter water stillness to something else, something that cracked open behind the grey like light through ice. "There you are," he said quietly, and the words were not triumphant, not surprised, just certain, the tone of someone completing a sentence they had begun 3 years ago. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the cold road air on his clothes and pine, and beneath that something mineral and warm and strange that made the pulling sensation in her chest pull harder. His height was less overwhelming up close than it had been at a distance. Up close, he was just a man with shadows under his eyes and dust on his boots and hands that had too many old scars to have come from a life that was easy. She did not move. She had spent a great deal of her life becoming very good at not moving. "I can feel it," he said. Can you? She pressed her back against the grain stack and looked up at him and did not answer, because she could not answer, and also because she was afraid that if she moved at all she would shake, and she had not shaken in front of anyone in a very long time. His jaw tightened. He had looked at her the way the pack never looked at her, not past her, not through her, not at the general vicinity of her while thinking about something else. He looked at her, specifically at her. "You can't speak," he said. It was not a question. She shook her head, the smallest possible movement. Something shifted in his face. Not pity, she had seen pity and knew what it looked like. It looked like people trying not to look at your scar or your worn clothes or the specific angle of your shoulders that came from years of making yourself small. This was not that. This was something closer to rage, but the kind that was very cold, very controlled, pointing inward at a conclusion he had just reached. "Someone did that to you," he said. He said it the way you say a thing when you already know it is true, and are saying it aloud to confirm it to yourself, to make it real enough to act on. She looked at the wall. Then she looked at him. He followed her gaze. She led him out of the storage room, through the kitchen, through the low corridor that ran behind the hall, to the wall outside the locked records room, where her marks were still fresh, the charcoal barely an hour old. She stepped back and watched him read. He was not fast. He took his time with each notation, tracing them in the air without touching them, and she watched his face and learned it the way she learned everything. By paying attention to what other people's faces did when their minds were working. He was smart. That was the first thing she understood about him. Genuinely smart, not in the way that came from authority or certainty, but in the way that came from actually looking at things and letting what she saw change what he thought. He read her notation system, which she had never explained to anyone, and he worked out its logic as he went, and she could see him doing it, the small adjustments in his expression as each symbol resolved into meaning. His hands curled slowly into fists when he reached the tribute records, his jaw set. He crouched when he reached the structural warnings about the watchtower and the embankment, pressing one hand flat against the stone floor as if verifying something. When he found the small marks in the corner, she had almost hoped he would miss them. He went very still. He stayed crouched for a long time. "I have been here. How long?" he asked. "Have you been marking these walls?" She held up 3 fingers. He looked up at her. The grey of his eyes had gone darker, the ice fully broken now, something moving steadily underneath it. 3 years, he said. 3 years of accurate warnings on walls that someone has been scrubbing clean before anyone with authority could read them. She nodded. He stood. He was quiet for a moment in the way that certain people are quiet when they are not empty but full of decisions being made quickly and consequences being assessed. "I'm reading them now," he said. The tears came without her permission, as they always did on the rare occasions they came at all. She had learned not to be ashamed of them, exactly, but she had also learned to be very efficient about them, and she swiped at her face with the back of her hand before the second one finished forming. He did not comment. He did not reach for her. He simply stood where he was and looked at her without looking away. And the specific thing about it, the thing she had not experienced before in 3 years or 10 years or possibly ever, was that it did not feel like being examined. It felt like being witnessed. Halwyn and Mervan found them 4 minutes later. Halwyn's face went white when he saw the marks on the wall. Mervan, the pack alpha, was a wide man with a carefully composed expression that had, in Lys's observation, never once reflected what he was actually thinking, and it did not reflect anything now, which was its own kind of information. "Your Excellence," Halwyn began. "The Omega, she has been writing on walls for years. She has a fixation. The pack healer has examined her. She is not reliable." The war commander turned from the wall. "The root blight in the north perimeter," he said. His voice had returned to that precise carrying quality she had heard from the yard, not raised. Just clear in the way that made every other sound in the corridor seem to dim. "How far has it spread?" Halwyn blinked. "I don't." There is no. Because if the embankment above the outer road is compromised by root collapse before first frost, which this notation, he gestured toward the wall without looking at it, suggests will happen within the month. You lose the only maintained road access to your northern supply line during the worst quarter for overland travel. He paused. That is not a fixation. That is a structural analysis. Mavan had gone very quiet in the way of men who are reassessing. The tribute rolls, the war commander said. I will need to see the records room. The room is undergoing. Open it. Or I'll have my people open it. Those are your options. They chose to open it. He spent 2 hours in the records room. Liz sat in the corridor with her back against the wall and her knees drawn to her chest and listened to the systematic sound of ledgers being examined, pages being turned. Halwyn's diminishing attempts at explanation being answered with the specific silence of a man who had already understood everything and was simply confirming it. The war commander's second, a woman named Breck, short-haired, broad-shouldered, with the economical movements of someone who had spent years operating in small and dangerous spaces, came out twice to retrieve specific documents at his direction, and both times she looked at Liz with an expression that was not warm but was something functional and present, the look of a woman who noticed things and filed them without fuss. When he came out, it was over quickly. It was not dramatic. He spoke in the same precise, carrying voice. Mavan was relieved of command, pending tribunal effective immediately. The falsified counts would be referred to the Crown's administrative court, the contracts voided. The Omega, Mavan said, because even now, at the end, even now, she is hold property. She was registered as, she comes with me, the war commander said. The corridor became very still. She is my responsibility, Mavan tried. The pack, she is my mate. He said it simply, with no particular emphasis, the way you state a fact that is already true and requires no performance. She comes with me. That is not a point of negotiation. Liz, sitting against the wall with her knees to her chest, felt the pulling sensation in her sternum resolve into something that was not pulling anymore, something that settled, something that had been a sustained, low-grade ache for so long she had catalogued it under background conditions like cold floors and insufficient food, and now it simply wasn't that anymore. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside her. The stone was cool. Her marks were 2 corridors away. She had 3 years of warnings on walls that everyone had erased. She had 1 small line tucked into a corner that had not been a warning. I have been here. He heard it. She understood. In whatever way that worked, fate or bond or the specific biology of wolves who found their matches across impossible distances, he had heard that line most of all. She ate that night in a supply wagon that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the stew she was given was not exceptional, but she ate it with a fork and a spoon that matched each other. And the matching felt significant in a way that she could not have explained and did not try to. Breck sat across from her, reading reports, not watching her but present, a deliberate and unceremonious kindness. He has been doing border reviews for 4 years, Breck said without looking up. Every hold, every minor territory, 261 packs. She turned a page. His wolf started behaving strangely 4 years ago. Wouldn't settle. Couldn't be suppressed in formal settings. In the middle of a trade arbitration last winter, the wolf broke through completely, sat down in the middle of the session and refused to move for an hour. The corner of her mouth did something that was not quite a smile. It was a very important arbitration. Liz almost did something with her own mouth. She controlled it. He knew what it meant, Breck continued. He just hadn't found you yet. Liz touched her throat. The place where a voice should be. Breck read the gesture without looking up. We have people at the Capitol who can examine that. Good people, not the kind who charge a fee and shrug. She turned another page. If something was done to you, they'll find it. Liz pulled her journal. Breck had given her a journal and 2 pieces of charcoal an hour after they left Ashenville, with the same practical energy she brought to everything, and wrote, How do you know something was done? Breck looked at the page. Wolves don't go silent, not on their own, not completely, not wolves and voices both at the same time in someone who is otherwise intact. She went back to her reports. That's not nature. That's work. Liz fell asleep in the wagon without meaning to. She woke to changed light and the war commander sitting across from her, the window behind him, showing a late afternoon sky going orange at the edges. He looked as tired as he had in the yard at Ashenvale, the shadows under his eyes unchanged by the hours, the set of his jaw unchanged by the miles, but something in him was less taut. The way a cable looks when the tension hasn't been released, but the load it's been bearing has been, for the moment, set down. "You've been asleep for 6 hours," he said. "We stopped for the night." Breck disagreed with the decision. I overruled her. She sat up slowly, pulled her journal from where it had slid between her hip and the wagon seat. Wrote, "She seems like someone who dislikes being overruled." He read it and something happened to the set of his mouth. "She is exactly that. She has been overruled perhaps 12 times in 4 years, and she has been right about 8 of those. She holds the ratio over me regularly." Liz wrote, "What does she say about me?" "That you have the most systematic observational notation she has encountered outside a trained surveyor. That you have been doing accurate structural analysis on a hold that couldn't be bothered to look at you, and that someone owes you 3 years of back wages at minimum." He paused. "She also said your handwriting is better than mine," which she did not need to say but said anyway. He told her, that night and the nights that followed, about his wolf. A grey beast, mid-sized as pack wolves went, nothing remarkable to look at who had developed. 4 years ago, the habit of waking in the small hours of the night and sitting at the window and making a sound that was not a howl and not a whine but something in between, a frequency that got into the bones of everyone in the building and made sleep impossible. About the territorial reviews he had undertaken, 261 packs, every border hold, every minor territory, because the wolf had to be doing something with its urgency or it would eventually break through at a genuinely irreplaceable moment. She wrote him things in return. Not about Ashenvale, not at first. She wrote about the bracket fungus she had mapped along the north wall of the granary, which had been advancing 2 inches per week since midsummer. She wrote about the specific quality of stillness in the storage room just before the temperature outside dropped below freezing, which she had come to recognize as reliably as a clock. She wrote, "I have been learning the buildings here for 3 years and no one has ever asked me what I know." He read that one twice. His jaw did the thing she was beginning to recognize, the slight tightening that meant something had landed in a place that mattered. "I'm asking," he said. The capital was larger than anything she had experienced. She watched it approach through the wagon window, a city spread across rising ground with a fortress at its center that was old enough to have grown into itself, its walls thick with ivy, its towers uneven in the way of things built across generations by people with different ideas about what was needed. It looked like a place that had survived things. She found that she liked it for that reason. The healer at the capital was a man named Corvett, precise and unhurried, with the hands of someone accustomed to working carefully in small spaces. He examined her for the better part of an afternoon, and the war commander, whose name she had learned was Alden, stood in the corner the entire time, not interfering, just present, the pine and mineral smell of him steadying in a way she had come to rely on faster than she was entirely comfortable with. Corvett sat back at the end and looked at her for a long moment. "There is nothing wrong with your voice," he said. "Not physically. Your vocal cords are functional. Your throat is intact. There is no developmental anomaly." He paused. "There is, however, a suppression. Old work. I would estimate it was placed when you were 3 or 4. Blood magic, the kind that requires significant skill and significant intent. 2 bindings placed simultaneously. One on your voice, one on your wolf." Alden from the corner, "Can you remove it?" Corvett considered. "Yes. Carefully and not quickly. The binding has integrated. It will take several sessions." He looked at Liz. "It will not be comfortable." She wrote in her journal, "Who would do this to a child?" Corvett read it. He passed the journal to Alden, who read it and who was quiet for a long moment before he said, "That is what we are going to find out." The investigation took 8 days. Alden set Breck on it with a team of 3 record specialists, and they worked backward through Liz's provenance. The sparse record at Ashenvale, the transfer documents from the border holding that had passed her along, the administrative trail of a small pack called Grey Warden that had been dissolved 20 years ago when its alpha died without an acknowledged heir. On the 5th day, the record specialists found the hole in that last statement. Grey Warden's alpha had not died without an heir. She had been killed. A woman named Silver, one of the few female alphas in the Eastern Territories, who had had a gift for weather reading, not storm calling, just the quiet ability to know with consistent accuracy what was coming and when. A practical gift, a valuable gift, valuable enough that a neighboring pack had wanted it, and Silver had refused to negotiate, and 6 months after that refusal, Grey Warden had been dissolved in what the official records called a border conflict of unclear origin. Silver had had a daughter, 3 years old at the time of dissolution. The daughter had disappeared from the records immediately afterward, surfacing 2 years later in Ashenvale's intake logs as an unclaimed omega of unknown origin, with a dormant wolf and no discernible voice. She was sitting in the garden outside the lower healer's wing, writing in her journal. She was writing about the garden, specifically about the way the afternoon light moved across the stone paving, the specific color it turned at the moment before the sun went behind the western wall, which she had not had the leisure to observe anywhere before because there had always been something she was required to be doing. When Alden sat down beside her, he sat close. His arm touched hers, and the warmth of it moved through the bond in the way she was learning. The bond was not subtle, but it was precise, a temperature she was becoming fluent in. "We found your name," he said. She stopped writing. "Your mother was Silver of Grey Warden. She had a weather reader's gift and a wolf that went white in her last year, which the old accounts associate with a seer's bloodline manifesting late." He paused. "Your name is not Liz," she looked at him. "Your name is Vale." She turned the name over in her mind. The shape of it, the weight. It fit the way things fit when you have been carrying their absence without knowing the shape of what was missing. He continued, his voice level, which she understood by now was not flatness but control. The specific control of a man relaying information he was angry about in front of someone he did not want to frighten with his anger. Grey Warden was not dissolved by accident. The pack that arranged your mother's death was called Stonemantle. Their alpha at the time, a man named Vaith, wanted the weather-reading ability for his own bloodline. When Silver refused to negotiate a matched pairing, he arranged her killing and disguised it as a border skirmish. He could not kill a 3-year-old child. Your mother had placed a seer's ward before she died, the kind that returns harm to its source, so instead he had her binding placed by a hired practitioner and passed her to the nearest hold with falsified origin papers. Vale sat with this for a moment. She was not shaking. She thought she would be shaking. What she felt instead was a strange settling, the same quality as the pulling sensation resolving when Alden had said, "She comes with me in the corridor at Ashenvale." Something vast being set down. The story of her entire life rearranging itself around a new true center. She wrote, "Vaith. Is he still alive?" Alden read it. His jaw did the thing. "Yes, he is 63. Still Alpha of Stonemantle. He has been monitoring you." Breck found evidence that someone visited Ashenvale once every few years, casual inquiries about the mute omega in the lower kitchen. His hand, resting on his knee, was not a fist, but it was close. "He has been making sure you were still there, still silent, still nothing." She wrote, "I want to be there. When you confront him," he looked at the page. He looked at her. "You will be there," he said. "That is not a question." The unbinding took 9 sessions across 12 days. Corvette worked in the lower healer's room that smelled of dried valerian and hot beeswax, his hands steady on her temples and the base of her throat, his eyes closed, his expression the specific concentration of someone doing fine work under pressure. Each session left her wrung out in a way that was not physical exhaustion but something interior, as if the binding being loosened was connected to every part of her, and loosening it shifted everything. After the fourth session, she felt it, a flicker, distant and warm, behind the bond warmth, something else, a presence, not communicative, not yet, more like the way you feel a person enter a room before you see them, something aware, something that had been waiting a very long time, pressing with patient force against a wall built around it when it was barely formed. She pressed her hand to her sternum and felt it press back. Alden came every evening. He did not ride in the carriage with her. He had his own quarters and his own work, 261 packs worth of administrative consequence that did not pause for personal developments. But he came every evening and sat across from her and talked and read what she wrote, and the evenings became the thing she organized her days around without consciously deciding to do that. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 16 and who had kept a weather journal for 30 years, recording daily conditions in a notation so precise that Breck had once used it to accurately retrodict a border storm event from 40 years prior. He told her about his Wolf's first breakthrough in council, the trade arbitration, the hour of immobility, and the specific expression on the face of the senior trade commissioner, who was 69 and had been practicing a cultivated unflappability for decades, and who had, for the first time in recorded memory, been visibly flustered. He told her, on the 8th evening, that he had been afraid. Not of not finding you, he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the wall, which she had come to understand was how he organized difficult things, of finding you in a condition that I had not been able to prevent, of learning that whatever had been done to you had been done for long enough that the damage was permanent. He paused. Of arriving 4 years too late, she wrote, "You arrived, that is not nothing." He looked at the page for a long time. "No," he said, "it's not nothing." The binding broke on a Wednesday afternoon. She was in the garden again, kneeling on the paving stones, examining the bracket fungus on the garden wall. She had been tracking it for a week. It was advancing faster than she had estimated, which meant moisture was coming in through a crack she hadn't located yet, when she felt it. A crack, interior, precise, the sensation of something that had been built to last finally giving way, not to force from outside, but to pressure from within. 20 years of pressure, patient and consistent, applied by something that had never stopped trying. The binding broke. What came through was enormous. She had expected, in the abstract way she had tried to prepare for it, that her wolf would surface gradually. She had not expected it to arrive all at once, 20 years of compressed urgency, released in a single moment, filling her from the inside out like a room that has been dark suddenly full of light. She opened her mouth and made a sound she had never made in her life. It came out wrong at first, rough and fractured, vocal cords that had been inactive for 20 years trying to remember the mechanics of use. But it was real. It was hers. She felt it in her chest and her throat and the back of her teeth, and the sensation of making sound with her own body was so strange and so large that she sat down on the paving stones because her legs had stopped working. Then the wolf came. She did not know, afterward, how long the shift took. It felt simultaneous and geological. Her hands hit the ground and her fingers lengthened, and the bones of her face began to move with a sensation that was pain and something beyond pain. Something so bodily and immediate that it required her whole attention. She heard herself making sound the entire time, not screaming, not quite, something deeper, a sustained vocal note that rose and changed as the shift completed and became at its apex a howl. The wolf that came out of her was white. She could see it in her own vision and in the sudden stillness of the palace garden around her, in the way the few people who had been crossing the far end of the courtyard simply stopped and stared. Large. She registered in the strange dual awareness of the first shift that she was larger than she had expected, larger than she should have been, by the architecture of the courtyard she was moving through. The palace erupted. She heard it from outside and above and inside simultaneously. The alarm calls, the rapid footsteps, the sound of other wolves shifting, the clatter of guards who had been trained for many things but not for this. Alden arrived before she had fully processed that she was outside and enormous and frightening people. He did not come as a man. His wolf was grey, heavier through the chest than she would have guessed from his human frame, with eyes the same winter water grey of his human face and a scar along the jaw that mirrored his human one. He crossed the garden at a run and stopped in front of her and lowered his head in a gesture that was not submission but something adjacent to it, a deliberate reduction of his own posture to give her space to be large without feeling crowded. She pressed her muzzle against his and felt the bond between them close like a circuit. She felt his heart beat. Through it, fast. He was not calm either. He was simply, as he was in everything, managing it. They stayed in the garden for a long time. The palace guards stood in a ring and did not know what to do. Breck told them, from somewhere to the left, not to do anything, in a voice that made that instruction very easy to follow. When she shifted back, it was slower than the first shift had been, more like water returning to a natural level than something breaking. She was on her knees on the cold paving stones, and Alden was beside her in human form with a coat around her shoulders before she had finished coming back to herself. She looked up at him. She opened her mouth. The sound came out rough and slow, scraped clean by years of disuse, barely louder than the wind moving through the garden. Alden. His face did something she did not have words for yet. She was building a vocabulary for his expressions. She had started on the first night, adding to it each evening the way she built notation systems, symbol by symbol, but this one was new. It was the expression of a man who had been maintaining a very precise and very necessary control for a very long time, and who had just, in one syllable, lost it entirely. He said, again. She said his name again. Her voice cracked on it, rough and strange. She did not care. He kissed her. She had not expected it, and then immediately understood that she had been expecting nothing else. His hands were on her face, careful as everything he did, and the kiss was careful too, and she could feel his heartbeat through the bond, and through the thin layer of air between them, and it was no longer controlled at all. Breck found the truth 10 days later. The practitioner who had placed Vale's bindings had been found, through a chain of record work that Breck described as tedious in the way she described everything she was proud of, living in a coastal village 3 days' travel south. He had talked freely in exchange for immunity, and the testimony he provided corroborated everything the archivists had reconstructed. Vaith of Stonemantle, 63 years old, still alpha, still occupying the grazing territory he had taken from Grey Warden, still alive. They rode to Stonemantle with a formal party of 200. Vale rode beside Alden on a roan mare that Breck had selected for her, not because she had asked for one, but because Breck had assessed the situation and drawn the conclusion that she should not arrive at Stonemantle in a carriage. She wore proper riding clothes and boots with actual soles, and her hair was clean, and the pale marks on her hands, the charcoal-stained calluses of 3 years of marking walls, were visible, and she had decided not to hide them. Vaith met them at the gate. He was shorter than she had imagined, lean and grey-haired with eyes that were a flat, assessing brown. They moved to her the moment she rode in, and something shifted in them. Not recognition of her face, she had been 3 years old, but recognition of the situation, the careful calculation of a man who had planned for many contingencies and was now determining which one had arrived. Alden did not preface it or negotiate. He laid out the evidence, each element precise and documented, in the same carrying voice he used for everything. Vaith listened with the composed expression of a man who had been doing this for 60 years and did not show things unless he chose to. When Alden finished, Vaith looked at Vale. She looked back at him. She has Silver's eyes, Vaith said, almost to himself. I had forgotten that. He said it without apparent sentiment. As a man states a fact he had successfully not thought about for 20 years and was now required to acknowledge. There was no remorse in it. But there was something, a weight, the particular heaviness of a man who had carried the full cost of his own choices for so long that he had come to mistake the weight for structure. You will answer for this at tribunal, Alden said. Stonemantle's territory will be returned to its rightful heir. Vaith looked at Vale. The calculation in his eyes was still running, but slower now, the options narrowing to a point. She was a child, he said, and she understood he did not mean it as mitigation. He meant it as the specific thing it was, the line he had stopped at and the line he had crossed instead, and the long arithmetic of the years between. You silenced her for 20 years, Alden said. You let her be erased. Vaith had no answer. The tribunal took 3 weeks. Vale was present for every session. She sat beside Alden and wrote in her journal and spoke, when she was required to speak, in the rough and slowly strengthening voice that was becoming, day by day, less strange to her. She would never have a smooth voice. Corvet had told her so, not unkindly. 20 years of dormancy left permanent texture, a roughness that no amount of use would fully resolve. She had written in her journal when he said this, "Good. I don't want a smooth voice." She had not shown that page to anyone. Stonemantle's territory was formally reassigned. The grazing lands that Vaith had taken from Grey Warden were returned to Grey Warden's heir, which was Vale, which was a thing she had to say several times to herself in private before it became a fact she could hold steadily. The ceremony at the capital was not what she expected. She had expected formality, a great hall event with all its weight and occasion. What happened was smaller and better than that. Alden stood before his pack council and said, "This is your war commander's mate." He said it with the same flatness he brought to all true things. And the council, 16 people of varying ages and temperaments, including a senior logistics officer who had been with the Crown administration for 30 years and who had, Breck had warned her, very specific ideas about precedent, absorbed it in the way of people who had learned to trust his judgment through evidence. The logistics officer said, "The White Wolf." Alden said, "Yes." The logistics officer said, "Silver of Grey Warden had a white wolf in the last year of her life. There are accounts." He looked at Vale with the expression of someone locating a historical event they had thought was closed. "The bloodline continues." "Yes," Alden said. "Good," said the logistics officer with the finality of someone updating a file. "That's good." And then, because she had a voice and it was hers to use, Vale spoke. It was not a speech. She had not prepared one. She did not believe in performing things she could not feel. What she said was, "I have been marking walls for 3 years. I intend to keep marking them. If you have structures that need assessment, I am available." It was not what anyone had expected. Several people in the room looked uncertain about what to do with it. The logistics officer laughed, actually laughed, an honest sound, surprised out of him. "Practical," he said. "Yes," she said. The claiming happened not in the capital, not in a formal setting, but at Grey Warden, which she had not yet seen as herself, only as an absence, a record, a dissolving in someone else's ledgers. They rode there on a clear October afternoon, the 2 of them and Breck and 4 others, and the territory was wild with 20 years of being ungoverned, the fields gone back to meadow, the buildings reclaimed by ivy and moss and the slow, patient work of weather. But the old Alpha's orchard was still there, the trees gnarled and unpruned but producing, the ground beneath them thick with fallen fruit that the deer had been eating undisturbed for 2 decades. Vale stood in the orchard with her feet in the cold grass and looked at the trees her mother had planted and felt the white wolf press forward, not with the urgency of suppression finally released, but with something quieter. Recognition, the specific warmth of returning to a place that carries the shape of people who loved it. Alden stood before her. He had removed his traveling coat, and he was just himself in the flat October light, a tall, tired man with old scars and grey wolf eyes, and the particular quality of stillness she had come to understand was not emptiness but patience, the kind that came from having waited for something a very long time and finally being in its presence. "Vale," he said, "I want to claim you. I want you to claim me. I want every wolf in this territory to know it." He paused. "But I need you to say it in your own voice. I need to hear yes from you." She had been thinking about this word since the first time she had tried to use her voice. She had known, in the abstract, that it would be the first real word she would say. Not a name, not a test of mechanics, but something chosen. She had been saying yes in writing for years. She had yes in 3 notebooks and on the walls of 2 different holds and in the careful notation of 3 years of warnings that had all said, underneath the structural analysis, "I am here and I am paying attention and I believe this matters." "Yes," she said. The bite was precise and certain, and she felt it in every nerve, and the pain was there and was immediately drowned by something larger than pain. The bond closing like a lock finding its key, Alden's heartbeat inside her chest, the white wolf pressing against his grey wolf through the new permanent connection between them, and she threw her head back and made a sound that was half howl and half voice, and entirely hers. She marked him in return, less precise, more fierce. The taste of his blood was nothing like the taste of charcoal and cold walls. They returned to the capital as the first snow of the season began to come down, light and tentative, the kind of snow that doesn't commit to the ground yet. Vale watched it through the carriage window and wrote in her journal about the specific quality of it, the angle of fall, the way it moved in the wind. Light from the northwest, which would turn heavier by morning, which would mean the mountain pass north of Greywarden would close early this year, which would affect the supply logistics for 3 border holds through January. She showed Breck the page. Breck read it. She noted something on her own tablet and said, "I'll route the autumn deliveries by the coastal road." "Yes," Vale said, "do it now, before the 15th. Breck looked at her over the top of the tablet, a look that was assessment and underneath it something that was working its way toward respect. "The 15th, she confirmed. Outside the carriage, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the bond hummed with the particular warmth of something settled, not the vibration of distance being crossed, not the urgency of searching, but the warmth of 2 things that had been moving toward each other for a very long time finally at rest. She had a voice now, rough and particular and entirely her own, and the walls of the capital already had the first of her charcoal marks on them. Not warnings, not yet, just observations, the beginnings of a 3-year project of learning a new building. She had a great deal to say.